What if giving away the only meal you'd saved for 3 days didn't leave you hungry, but turned you into the man whose name now shines on a $25 million community center? Darius Johnson's mornings did not begin with an alarm clock. The old plastic thing on his nightstand had stopped ringing years ago, its cracked face stuck forever at 2:17. But his body knew. At exactly 5:30 a.m. his eyes opened, not because of luxury or choice, but because habit and necessity trained him to rise with the first hint of dawn. He rolled out of the narrow twin bed he had slept in since he was 8 years old, the same bed his grandmother had scraped together money to buy before the accident that changed everything. The floorboards groaned under his weight, each creak loud in the silence of their small wooden house on Elm Street. He froze for a moment, listening to the rasping breath that came from the other room. Miss Ruby, his grandmother, always woke before him but pretended to sleep. She knew the boy worried, and worry was a heavy enough burden for 17 shoulders already bent under too much. He moved carefully, pulling on the same faded jeans he had worn yesterday, the knees whitened with wear, the pocket holding only a few crumpled bills for bus fare. He checked twice, because sometimes the difference between riding and walking 3 miles was the difference between exhaustion and collapse. When he slipped past Miss Ruby's door, he caught the sound more clearly, a thin wheeze, a chest fighting for air even in stillness. In the dim light he saw her hand rest against the oxygen tank that was too often empty, too expensive to refill as often as she needed. For a moment he wanted to step inside, to say something, anything. But then she whispered into the shadows, her voice paper thin but steady, "Baby, being poor don't mean you can't be proud." It was her way of telling him she was awake, that she knew his footsteps, that she wanted him to carry strength into the day. He swallowed hard, nodded even though she couldn't see him, and closed the door softly behind him. Outside, the world was split in two. To the west, grand houses stood behind tall hedges, their driveways lit with security lights, their windows glowing warm with the smell of bacon and coffee drifting from unseen kitchens. To the east, his direction, the street grew rougher with each block. Chain-link fences leaned like tired men, graffiti-covered brick walls, and abandoned cars slumped on curbs with shattered glass for eyes. Elm Street sat on the edge of both worlds, its peeling yellow paint and sagging porch steps caught between pride and surrender. Darius tugged his thin jacket tighter around him and began the walk toward Murphy's diner. The air still carried the chill of night, but the sky was softening from black to a bruised gray. He passed manicured lawns where sprinklers hissed in steady rhythm, their owners still asleep under expensive quilts. A few streets later, the view shifted to cracked pavement and shuttered storefronts, where neon signs flickered half-dead and dogs barked behind rusted gates. He kept his head down, his stride steady, as if by moving quickly enough he could slip between the two worlds unnoticed. He thought about his grandmother's words, the ones she repeated like scripture. Poverty was their reality, but dignity was their choice. She had taught him that pride wasn't about money in the bank or names on plaques. It was about keeping your clothes clean even when they were old, speaking kindly even when life was cruel, standing tall even when the weight of the world tried to bend you. And so he carried himself with a quiet resilience, the kind that made strangers nod in silent respect without knowing why. By the time he reached the diner, the horizon had begun to bleed pale gold, sunlight catching on rain puddles left from last night's storm. Murphy's diner sat on the corner of 5th and Main like a tired but loyal friend, its fluorescent lights buzzing against the dawn. Inside, Big Mike was already chopping onions, his broad shoulders hunched with focus. He glanced up, gave Darius the same curt nod he always did. No words, but an understanding passed between them. Darius arrived every morning, without complaint, without excuse. That was enough. As Darius pushed through the swinging kitchen door, he slipped into routine as if routine itself were salvation. Stack plates, scrub in hot soapy water, rinse, dry, repeat. The steam burned his hands, the scent of grease clung to his clothes, but the rhythm was almost comforting. He imagined other hands, softer ones, holding pens or textbooks instead of cracked porcelain. He wondered what college hands felt like, if he would ever know. Yet even as he dreamed, he worked with the precision of someone who understood that dreams alone could not keep the lights on at home. The clatter of dishes, the hum of the diner, the thought of Miss Ruby whispering pride into his ear, these were the sounds of his morning. Harsh, yes, but not hopeless. And somewhere in that fragile space between fatigue and resolve, a story was waiting to unfold, one that would test the truth of his grandmother's words in ways neither of them could yet imagine. Roosevelt High didn't look like the kind of place where dreams were born. The bricks sagged with age, the paint peeled in long strips, and the computer lab still ran machines older than most of the students. The hallway lights flickered overhead, buzzing like tired bees, and lockers stood dented with doors that barely latched. Yet inside these crumbling walls, Darius carried himself differently. Here he wasn't just the dishwasher from Murphy's Diner. He was the boy who aced every test, the quiet one teachers leaned on to help others, the student who made something out of nothing. That morning, after his shift, he arrived with damp hair from the walk, his backpack still smelling faintly of soap and fryer grease. He slipped into English class and took his usual seat near the window. Mrs. Patterson, tall, sharp-eyed, and endlessly hopeful, noticed him immediately. She always did. She placed a manila folder on his desk, her voice low but certain. "Darius, I think you should look at this." He opened it carefully, the way someone handles fragile glass. Inside were scholarship applications, glossy brochures of universities with green lawns and soaring libraries, smiling students carrying books instead of dish trays. For a moment he let himself imagine it, walking under arches older than his grandmother, studying in quiet halls filled with light, wearing clothes bought new instead of passed down. But the moment was fleeting. Numbers glared back at him from the pages. Tuition, fees, housing, books. Even with scholarships, the sums looked impossible, mountains he had no equipment to climb. Mrs. Patterson leaned closer. "You have a gift with words. You could write essays that move people, maybe even win the funding you need. Don't sell yourself short." He nodded, polite, but the weight in his chest told a different story. Kids like him didn't go to those places. Kids like him worked, paid bills, maybe took night classes if life allowed. The bell rang, pulling him back into the rhythm of Roosevelt High. In the cafeteria, he sat at the edge of a long table, unwrapping 2 slices of white bread pressed together with peanut butter. Across from him, boys in Letterman jackets laughed with mouths full of pizza, fries, cartons of chocolate milk. One of them glanced over, smirked, and muttered just loud enough for others to hear, "Look, Johnson's got gourmet again. Bread and glue." Laughter rippled down the table. Darius kept his eyes on the sandwich, chewing slowly, tasting not just peanut butter but the sting of being reminded he didn't belong. He wanted to be angry, but anger took energy, and energy was a currency he couldn't waste. Instead, he focused on the folder still in his backpack. Inside those papers was a door, cracked open, but the handle seemed miles out of reach. As the lunchroom noise swelled, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Miss Ruby. "Baby, if you pass the pharmacy, can you get my pills?" He froze. He knew the pills she meant, the ones lined up in plastic trays on the kitchen counter. Blood pressure, arthritis, the ones that kept her moving when her body wanted to quit. He typed back slowly, careful not to let guilt seep into the words. "Sure, Grandma." Then he checked his wallet. 3 crumpled bills, barely enough for bus fare home. The pills cost double that. He closed his eyes, swallowing the frustration that rose like bile. Not today. Not yet. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and told himself she would understand, because she always did, but it didn't make the weight any lighter. The rest of the day passed in a blur of equations, history dates, and locker slams. Every time he reached into his bag, the folder brushed against his hand like a cruel reminder. Dreams on one side, unpaid bills and medicine bottles on the other. By the final bell, he felt stretched thin, like a rope pulled too tight. As students spilled into the parking lot, some climbing into cars their parents bought, others laughing with plans for the mall or the movies, Darius turned east toward Elm Street. His shoes slapped against pavement cracked with weeds, and he carried the folder like a secret he wasn't ready to share. He thought about the universities in the brochures, their green lawns and bright futures, and then he thought about his grandmother's message, the pills she wouldn't take tonight. The contrast sliced him open. The truth was harsh and simple: he couldn't afford to dream when survival itself cost more than he had. He lifted his head as the sun dipped low, painting the sky a bruised purple. Pride, Miss Ruby always said, pride was free. But pride couldn't pay for textbooks, or for medicine, or for the years it would take to climb out of Elm Street. And yet, as he walked past the broken windows of the abandoned mall, he whispered to himself what Mrs. Patterson had told him, words that clung like a lifeline. Dreams have a way of finding funding when the dreamer is worthy. He wasn't sure if he believed her. But he wanted to. And sometimes wanting was the only thing that kept him moving forward. Murphy's Diner was more than a job to Darius, it was a second home, though not the kind filled with comfort or laughter. The smell of grease clung to his clothes, the hiss of the fryer echoed in his dreams, and the rhythm of dishes hitting soapy water became the soundtrack of his life. Morning and night, before and after school, he stood at that sink, his rough hands moving through the endless cycle of scrub, rinse, dry, stack. To anyone else, it might have felt like punishment, but to Darius it was survival. For 3 days he carried a secret plan, one he protected like treasure. He wanted a meal. Not just any meal, not the scraps he ate standing in the back or the peanut butter sandwiches stuffed into his backpack. A real meal, one ordered off the menu, brought to him at a table like any other customer. For 3 days he denied himself the smallest comforts. He walked instead of riding the bus, each mile adding weight to his already weary legs. He skipped the vending machine when hunger gnawed between classes, telling himself that the growl in his stomach was the sound of saving. At Murphy's, when the smell of fries and burgers tempted him so strongly it hurt, he reminded himself to wait. One meal. That was the promise. His co-workers noticed the difference but said nothing. Big Mike raised an eyebrow when he saw Darius leave at night, shoulders heavy from the 3-mile walk home, but he didn't ask. Maybe he knew better than to pry. Maybe he saw the determination in the boy's eyes and respected it in silence. By the end of the 3rd day, Darius felt the sacrifice in his bones. His stomach ached like a hollow drum, his legs burned from walking, and his head swam from the constant buzz of fatigue. Still, he held on to the thought of sitting down at Murphy's not as an employee but as a paying customer. The thought carried him through, like a flickering lantern in a long dark tunnel. That evening, as the rain began to tap against the diner windows, Sandy leaned against the counter with another waitress, her voice low but not low enough to miss. "That boy works harder than anyone here," she said, nodding toward the kitchen where Darius stacked plates taller than his arms. "And I swear, he's probably never even sat at one of our tables to eat." The other waitress shook her head, eyes following the thin figure bent over the sink. "Can't imagine he could afford it. He's just a kid, and kids like that don't get to be customers." Darius pretended not to hear, but their words cut deeper than they knew. He didn't want pity, didn't want anyone to see how carefully he had counted coins in his pocket, how he had folded bills until they grew soft at the edges. Tonight, he told himself, would be different. Tonight he would take those coins and bills and buy himself a seat at the table like everyone else. He pictured it. The red leather booth, the smell of fresh fries steaming in front of him, the burger heavy in his hands. Not a sandwich from home, not a stolen bite between shifts, but a meal he had earned. Each sacrifice became a brick in the foundation of that moment. The skipped sodas, the aching walks, the gnawing hunger, all of it was building toward something small yet monumental. For 3 days he lived with the anticipation, with the hope that maybe sitting in that booth would make him feel less invisible. What he couldn't know, what Sandy's whisper hinted at without her realizing, was that this simple dream of his would collide with a test much larger than a burger and fries. The world had been watching him quietly, arranging pieces in the shadows, and soon his 3 days of sacrifice would become the stage for a choice far greater than he could imagine. For now, all he saw was the plate he longed for, and all he felt was the hunger that made that plate worth everything. The storm rolled in like an army, slamming rain against the wide windows of Murphy's diner until the glass trembled in its frame. Lightning split the night sky, and for a second the whole parking lot lit up in a ghostly white before falling back into shadows. Inside, the diner glowed with fluorescent light, warm and steady against the chaos outside. The dinner rush had thinned, only a few booths still occupied, the smell of coffee lingering in the air. Behind the counter, Darius wiped his hands on a towel, heart beating with anticipation. For 3 days he had saved, denied himself every comfort, and now, finally, his tray was ready. A burger stacked high, golden fries still sizzling from the fryer, a paper cup of soda beating with cold. It wasn't just food. It was proof that sacrifice meant something, that even a boy scraping plates could have a moment that felt like dignity. He picked up the tray carefully, almost reverently, as if afraid the moment might slip away before he could taste it. He scanned the diner for a booth, choosing one near the window where he could watch the storm rage while he ate. But then he saw them. Table 6, in the far corner, usually reserved for couples celebrating anniversaries or families with birthdays. Tonight, it held an elderly couple who looked like they had stepped out of another world and stumbled into the wrong one. The man sat rigid, his gray hair plastered to his forehead, his expensive suit clinging like wet paper. The woman's silver hair dripped onto a designer coat that looked far too fine to be sitting in Murphy's. Their cups of coffee had gone cold, untouched for nearly an hour. Darius slowed, tray in hand, as the woman rummaged through her purse for the 4th time. Each movement was sharper, more frantic, until finally she spilled its contents onto the table. Tissues, glasses, a scattering of mints. No wallet. Her voice cracked as she whispered urgently to her husband. He patted his coat pockets, then his pants, checked again with rising desperation. He produced only a gold pocket watch, polished and gleaming even under the harsh lights. He turned it over in his hand as if hoping money might appear behind the glass. Nothing. The woman's voice rose just enough for Darius to hear. I don't understand. I had it when we left the house. She looked at him with eyes rimmed red from more than rain. He shook his head slowly, his jaw tightening with defeat. Sandy, carrying a checkbook in one hand, approached with obvious reluctance. She had seen situations like this before, though rarely with people so well dressed. She set the slip of paper down gently. I'm sorry, folks, but, the woman cut her off, her cheeks flushed with humiliation. We seem to have misplaced our wallet. This has never happened. Her husband cleared his throat, the authority in his voice still present beneath the weariness. Perhaps we could leave something as collateral. My watch, my wife's papers. We'll return tomorrow to settle the bill. Sandy glanced toward the kitchen where Big Mike stood, arms folded across his chest. He shook his head firmly. The diner ran on tight margins. No money, no meal. Rules were rules. I'm afraid we can't, sir, Sandy said softly. The man rose slowly, dignity intact but pride cracked. Come, Margaret. We'll figure something out. Margaret clutched a leather portfolio to her chest as if it were the only thing left protecting her. As she stood, the flap shifted, and for just an instant Darius saw what was inside. Documents, embossed with an unfamiliar gold logo, shimmering faintly under the fluorescent light. He couldn't place it, but something about it felt out of place in this diner, out of place in their story. Before he could look closer, she pulled the flap shut and turned toward the door. Outside, the storm howled louder, rain slanting sideways, lightning painting their broken-down car like a stranded island in a black sea. Margaret hesitated at the door, glancing back once at the warmth they were leaving behind. Her husband pressed his hand to the handle, ready to pull her into the storm. And there stood Darius, his tray still warm in his hands, the meal he had sacrificed 3 days for. His stomach twisted, hollow and demanding. The smell of the burger rose, sharp and intoxicating. He imagined sitting down, taking the first bite, feeling full for the first time in days. Yet his eyes kept returning to Margaret's trembling shoulders, to the humiliated way Harold, he hadn't caught his name yet, kept his back straight while his pockets lay empty. The diner was quiet now, all eyes darting between the boy with the tray and the couple at the door. The storm outside seemed to press its weight against the glass, urging a decision. In that silence, the choice lay bare. Hunger or kindness? Self or sacrifice? The meal in his hands or the dignity of two strangers? And though he didn't know it yet, though he couldn't possibly imagine, this wasn't just a decision about dinner. It was a test written in the lightning outside and in the strange gold logo inside Margaret's portfolio, a test that would alter the path of his life forever. The neon sign outside Murphy's diner flickered like a tired heartbeat, its red glow spilling across the rain-slicked floor every time the door swung open. Margaret's hand clung to her husband's as they took the first steps toward the storm, their dignity held together by nothing but stubborn will. The tray in Darius's hands grew heavier by the second, the burger and fries cooling, the soda losing its fizz, yet the weight pressing on him wasn't food, it was choice. His stomach knotted, empty from days of sacrifice, and for a split second he imagined what it would feel like to finally sit in a booth and eat like everyone else. But the image dissolved when he saw Margaret pause at the door, her shoulders slumping as though she could already feel the storm swallowing her whole. Without thinking, without weighing the consequences, Darius moved. "Sandy," he called, his voice louder than he meant, carrying across the diner. The elderly couple turned, startled, as the boy crossed the floor in quick strides, his tray balanced carefully. He stopped just short of them, chest rising and falling with the urgency of someone who had already made up his mind. He slid the tray onto their table with a steady hand. "This one's on me tonight." The words hung in the air, simple, unadorned, but sharp enough to cut through the storm outside. Margaret blinked rapidly, her lips trembling. "Oh, sweetheart, that's very kind, but we couldn't possibly." Darius pushed the tray closer, his voice soft but firm. "Please." He didn't offer explanations, didn't tell them about the 3 days of skipped meals or the miles walked. He just offered what he had. His grandmother's words rose unbidden in his mind, words he repeated now as if they belonged to the moment itself. "My grandma always says kindness is the only thing that multiplies when you give it away." Harold's pale blue eyes fixed on him, unwavering. For a long beat he said nothing, just studied the boy's face with a gaze that felt less like gratitude and more like an evaluation. Something flickered there, hidden behind the calm surface, something calculating. Still, his tone when he finally spoke was measured and dignified. "Son, this is your meal. You worked for this." Darius shook his head. "And I can work for another one." He turned to Sandy, who had been watching with her order pad pressed against her chest. "Can you bring them some fresh coffee? And maybe see if Big Mike will let you use the kitchen phone to call about their car." Sandy's eyes softened, and she nodded quickly, already moving to the counter. Margaret lowered herself into the booth with trembling hands, her fingers brushing over the edge of the tray as if it were something sacred. She reached for a fry, hesitated, then whispered almost to herself, "We haven't eaten since breakfast." Harold remained standing, still watching Darius. Finally he extended a hand, strong despite the years etched into his skin. "Harold," he said evenly. "And this is my wife, Margaret." Darius shook his hand, the grip surprisingly firm. "Darius. Darius Johnson." Margaret smiled faintly, her eyes glistening as she lifted a fry to her lips. The storm outside cracked again, lightning flashing across the window, but inside the diner a different kind of electricity filled the air. It wasn't just that Darius had given them his dinner. It was the way he carried himself, quiet, steady, as if this sacrifice were nothing extraordinary. As if kindness were as natural as breathing. Harold sat finally, though his gaze never broke from the boy. The look unsettled Darius. It wasn't the wide-eyed gratitude he might have expected. It was sharper, like a man taking notes, measuring, filing something away. Darius didn't understand it then, couldn't have, but that look was the beginning of something far larger than a free burger and fries. Sandy returned with steaming mugs, setting them gently on the table. She leaned close to Darius, her voice low enough only he could hear. "You're a good kid. You know that?" He shrugged, uncomfortable under the weight of her praise. They just needed it more. As Margaret sipped the coffee with trembling hands, her leather portfolio shifted again on the seat beside her. The flap slipped open for the briefest moment, and Darius caught another glimpse of that embossed gold logo gleaming under the diner's harsh lights. It tugged at something in his memory, though he couldn't place where he had seen it before. Margaret closed it quickly, holding it close, and the moment passed. But Harold saw the flicker in Darius's eyes and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging that the boy had noticed. The rain outside beat harder against the glass, thunder rolling like drums of war, but at table 6 a quieter storm was gathering, one made of questions unasked and futures yet unseen. Darius sat back, his stomach still empty but his heart strangely full, unaware that in choosing hunger over selfishness he had stepped onto a path that would change not only his life, but the life of everyone around him. And all the while, Harold's pale blue eyes never stopped studying him, not with pity, but with something far more dangerous, recognition. The next morning began like any other, but it carried a strange tension that Darius couldn't shake. Roosevelt High buzzed with the usual chatter, lockers slamming, sneakers squeaking on tile floors, but whispers followed him down the hallway. Students stared a second longer than normal, teachers exchanged glances he didn't understand. Before first period ended, the intercom crackled with a call that froze him in his seat. "Darius Johnson, please report to the principal's office." In 6 years at Roosevelt High he had never been summoned there, not once. As he walked the corridor, his palms grew damp, his steps unsteady. Through the glass windows of the office he saw them before he entered, Harold and Margaret, seated across from Principal Martinez, their posture sharp, their clothes immaculate, their presence commanding. They were no longer the shivering, rain-soaked couple from Murphy's Diner. They looked like they had stepped out of a boardroom, every inch of them polished and in control. On the desk lay a thick folder, Darius's school photo clipped to the cover, his name in bold letters across the top. His throat went dry. The secretary opened the door. "They're waiting for you." Darius stepped inside and the world tilted. Harold stood, extending a hand with the quiet authority of a man used to being obeyed. "Good morning, son." His voice was steady, formal. Darius stared, unable to find words. You're not," Margaret smiled faintly, though her eyes remained serious. "We are not what you thought." She tapped the folder on the desk. "And neither are you." Principal Martinez slid the folder toward Darius. Page after page of documentation spilled out, transcripts, attendance records, teacher evaluations, even notes from neighbors and coworkers. Darius flipped through in disbelief, his life laid bare in neat paragraphs. His grades, his hours at Murphy's, his volunteer tutoring sessions, even the Tuesday afternoons when he carried groceries for Mrs. Carter. It felt invasive, overwhelming. "You've been watching me," he whispered. Harold corrected him calmly. "We've been evaluating you." Darius's head snapped up, confusion turning to anger. "Evaluating? Last night, you lied. The car, the wallet, you made it all up." Harold's gaze was unflinching. "Last night wasn't about food. It was about character. And son, you passed." The words landed with the weight of a gavel. Darius felt his stomach churn, a cocktail of pride, anger, and disbelief. "You tested me? Like some kind of experiment?" Margaret leaned forward, her voice softer but no less firm. "We needed to see who you were when there was nothing to gain. Character is not proven by comfort, Darius. It's revealed by sacrifice." Principal Martinez, who had been silent until now, spoke gently. Darius, they're offering you an opportunity beyond anything I've ever seen in 30 years of education. Darius shook his head, overwhelmed. What kind of opportunity? Harold opened the portfolio Margaret carried and spread its contents across the desk. Architectural blueprints, legal contracts, letters on embossed letterhead. At the top of one page, his name stood out in bold. The Darius Johnson Community Development Center. His heart lurched. What is this? Margaret's tone shifted to businesslike precision. A $25 million initiative. A state-of-the-art community center to be built right here, on the land where the Riverside Mall has stood abandoned for years. Medical clinics, computer labs, job training programs, a library, youth spaces. A place your neighborhood has needed for decades. And we want you to help lead it. Darius stumbled back into his chair. The words made no sense. Why me? I'm just a kid who washes dishes. Harold's eyes narrowed, not unkindly but with conviction. No. You are the boy who gave his only meal to strangers. You are the boy who carries groceries for neighbors, tutors classmates during lunch, works to support his grandmother without complaint. That is leadership. That is vision. Darius's chest tightened, caught between awe and fear. The folder in front of him looked like a dream but felt like a trap. So all of it, happened because I gave you a burger and fries? Harold shook his head. No. It happened because of who you already were before that moment. The meal simply proved it. Margaret added, we don't invest in buildings. We invest in people. And we believe in you. Darius stared at the blueprints, the elegant lines of a future he couldn't yet imagine. A library filled with light. A clinic where his grandmother could receive care. Classrooms with computers that actually worked. His name engraved on the building's front. It was too much, too fast. I don't understand, he muttered. Why disguise yourselves? Why trick me? Harold's voice carried no apology. Because authenticity cannot be faked. If we had walked in as ourselves, you might have acted differently. Respect, deference, expectation. We needed to know how you treated people you thought had nothing to give you. And you showed us. Darius felt a flush of betrayal. So I was a test. Harold nodded once. And you were the answer. Principal Martinez leaned forward. Darius, they're offering a full scholarship to any accredited university. Tuition, housing, expenses, all covered. Summers spent interning with their foundation, learning nonprofit leadership. And when you graduate, a position as assistant director of this center, leading to full directorship if you choose it. The office grew silent except for the sound of Darius's pulse thundering in his ears. He wanted to reject it, to push it away because of the deception, but part of him already felt the pull. His grandmother's medicine bottles, the peeling paint on Elm Street, the children at Roosevelt High sharing broken computers. This was bigger than him. Margaret's voice softened. You have every right to feel conflicted. But understand this. What you did last night, giving up your only meal, told us something money cannot buy. Integrity. Compassion. Character. That is why we're here. Harold slid a heavy business card across the desk, its gold logo gleaming, the same one Darius had glimpsed in Margaret's portfolio. Take time to decide. 2 weeks if you need it. But remember, this isn't about us. It's about you, your grandmother, your community. And it's about proving that sometimes the right choice in a quiet diner can echo louder than thunder. Darius sat frozen, staring at the card, the blueprints, the impossible future laid out before him. He wasn't sure whether to feel chosen or tricked, blessed or betrayed. All he knew was that everything had changed, and nothing would ever be simple again. 18 months later, the place where dreams once went to die had been reborn. The Riverside Mall, once a hollow shell of broken glass and boarded windows, now stood transformed into a beacon of steel and glass that caught the morning sun like a crown. Above the entrance, in letters both elegant and bold, glowed a name no one on Elm Street could have imagined seeing: the Darius Johnson Community Development Center. On opening day, the streets around it overflowed with neighbors, families, and city officials. Children chased one another across the new playground, their laughter ringing through air that once echoed with silence. Vendors set up tables of food, while local musicians played tunes that mixed hope with celebration. Inside, every hallway gleamed, every room alive with purpose. The medical clinic buzzed with nurses and doctors already treating patients who once had to travel miles for basic care. Miss Ruby, seated proudly in a wheelchair at the ribbon cutting, smiled wider than she had in years. Her oxygen tank was gone, her diabetes under control, her arthritis eased by regular therapy she could finally afford. She leaned close to Darius, whispering with that same stubborn pride she carried through every hardship. "Baby, being poor don't mean you can't be proud. But now look at you. You gave us more than pride, you gave us hope." Darius, now 20, taller, carrying himself with quiet confidence, squeezed her hand, humbled by how far they had come. In the computer labs upstairs, rows of sleek screens glowed as teenagers learned skills their school had never been able to teach them. Jerome's mother, once stuck in low-wage work, now took design courses that landed her first paying clients. Big Mike, the gruff diner owner, expanded his catering business with 6 new employees trained in the center's commercial kitchen. Sandy opened a small cafe inside the building, her eyes with the first day she served coffee not as a waitress scraping tips, but as the proud owner of her own place. Roosevelt High's students came daily for tutoring programs, test scores rising faster than anyone believed possible. For every statistic, there was a face. A boy who finally got glasses and could read his textbooks. A grandmother who filled her prescription without fear of choosing between medicine and rent. A young mother who finished her GED and walked out of the center with a job offer. The ripple was real, visible, undeniable. Darius balanced his studies at State University with his role as the center's assistant director. He split his weeks between lectures on nonprofit management and nights at the center, walking the halls, listening to stories, making sure no one felt invisible the way he once had. The news called it the Darius effect. The governor praised it as a model for the state. But Darius kept his focus small, grounded in the lives in front of him. He didn't see numbers or headlines. He saw neighbors, and he saw a duty to honor the trust placed in him. Yet for all the grand speeches and milestones, the moment that defined him came quietly, late one evening at Murphy's Diner. The place hadn't changed much. The same neon buzzed in the window, the same booths sagged with age, the same smell of coffee clung to the air. But for Darius, stepping inside now felt like stepping into a memory. He spotted them right away. A young Hispanic couple sat in the corner booth, their clothes travel-worn, 2 small children clinging to them. Their table held only 2 cups of coffee, going cold, their voices hushed in embarrassed Spanish as the husband counted coins with shaking hands. The wife apologized to Sandy in broken English, cheeks flushed with humiliation. Darius didn't need the details. He saw it instantly, the same pride and desperation he had once witnessed, the same storm of fear and dignity colliding in weary faces. Without hesitation, he walked to the counter, ordered 2 meals, and carried them to the table. The couple looked up, startled, as he set the plates down. The words came easily, echoing across time. "This one's on me tonight." The wife's eyes filled with tears. The husband tried to protest, but Darius shook his head gently. "Please. Eat." Sandy, watching from behind the counter, froze as recognition washed over her. She remembered another night, another couple, another boy with nothing but still willing to give. And now that boy had become the man offering the same gift. History repeated itself, but this time with roles reversed, the circle complete. As the children ate hungrily, Darius sat with the family, listening to their story. Migrants from the south, their car had broken down on the highway, their savings barely enough for the towing fee. The husband was skilled in construction, the wife in childcare, but they had no references, no place to start. Darius smiled, sliding a card across the table. Simple, professional, with the gold emblem of the center on one side and his handwritten note on the back. We're always looking for good people. Come by tomorrow. We'll help you get started. The husband stared at the card, his lips trembling as he read the name. Darius Johnson. The same way Harold once spoke it aloud, testing its weight, recognizing its promise. The echo was unmistakable. That night, as he walked home past the glowing glass walls of the center that bore his name, Darius thought about Harold and Margaret. They had stood in the back during the ribbon cutting, quiet, letting the community take the spotlight. He had thanked them, but they had insisted the credit was not theirs. We only opened the door, Harold had told him. You chose to walk through it. Now, watching children play under the new lights, hearing laughter spill into the street, Darius finally understood. Kindness was never a transaction. It was a seed, planted in moments no one expected, watered by sacrifice, and grown into forests of change. Miss Ruby's words returned to him again, but this time they sounded different. Being poor don't mean you can't be proud. And now, being proud didn't mean standing alone. It meant lifting others until they stood with you. Months later, when Harold called to check on the center's progress, his voice warm but still carrying that edge of authority, Darius answered with the calm of someone who finally believed he belonged. It's going well, he said. Really well. I think I finally understand what you told me once, that kindness is the only investment that always pays dividends. Harold chuckled on the other end. And what's your return so far? Darius looked through the glass into the bustling center, neighbors learning, patients healed, jobs created, children dreaming bigger than Elm Street had ever allowed. He smiled. Immeasurable. That was the real twist. The burger and fries he gave away that rainy night had multiplied into thousands of meals, thousands of lessons, thousands of futures changed. One act of kindness had grown into a legacy, and the echo of his words, "This one's on me tonight," would continue long after his voice was gone. Transformation wasn't a destination. It was a choice, made again and again, one act at a time. And in that choice, a boy once invisible had stepped fully into the light. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.